In ancient Egypt, the most powerful weapon wasn't the Hopesh sword or the golden chariot. It was the pharaoh's penis. Yes, you heard that right. Entire civilizations, from the rise of the Nile to the fall of empires, were said to depend on a man's sexual prowess. And when that living weapon showed signs of failure, they resorted to sex magic methods so horrific that history deliberately erased them. To understand the extent of this madness, put yourself in the shoes of the head of the royal embalming team. Tonight, you are not a monk, you are a butcher. The woman lying on the marble slab before you is the great empress, but the order you have received is not to honor her. It is an intentional insult. The high priest stood in the shadows, his voice cold as stone. You will not embalm her in the usual way. You will open her body. Remove her womb, her ovaries, every trace of life she ever bore. Place them in a separate jar. Then sew her back up as if nothing had happened. Perfect on the outside, but empty on the inside. This was not embalming. This was a sacrificial ritual on the operating table. The logic was simple and brutal. The Nile was drying up. The gods were turning away. If the pharaoh's life energy was not enough to satisfy them, perhaps the queen's death energy, the complete destruction of her fertility, would. Welcome to the naked truth of Egypt. The history you learned in school is a lie. A lie created by 19th century explorers, men in khakis, who stumbled upon the evidence and were so horrified they destroyed it or hid it. They showed us the gold and the stories of the gods. They hid the sex, the brutality, and the dark rituals that underpinned it all. The most obvious evidence of this cover-up comes from the world's most famous tomb. In 1925, Howard Carter discovered the mummy of King Tutankhamun. Among all the gold and jewels, one thing was suspiciously missing. Fact: King Tut's mummy was found without a penis. Fact: initial reports noted it was not decomposed, but had been neatly removed. Fact: his heart, the most important organ for the afterlife, was also missing. Fact: he wasn't the only one. Genital modifications have been found in many other royal mummies. The Victorians tried to explain this away as an embalming accident, but that was another lie. Why would a culture obsessed with preserving the body intact for eternal life deliberately mutilate the bodies of their divine kings? The answer will shock you. Genital mutilation is just the tip of the iceberg. It is the key to a worldview where sex is used as a tool to control the universe, where children are sacrificed in temples, and where religious festivals turn into weeks-long orgies of violence. Why would a civilization mutilate the bodies of its own gods? Why would they perform such dark and desperate sexual rituals? The answer is even more shocking than the act itself. Because for the Egyptians, the human body was not sacred. It was a machine. And the universe was a larger machine, a machine that needed fuel. That fuel was sexual energy. Forget what you learned. The roots of Egyptian belief do not begin with an all-powerful God creating light. They begin with a sacred act of masturbation. In the primordial darkness, the god Atum created the universe himself. He took his penis and ejaculated, and from his semen, the first two gods, air and moisture, were born. Yes, in Egyptian mythology, all life originated from a divine orgasm. This core belief shaped everything. If the semen of a god could create the universe, then the life-giving fluids of earth must have a similarly divine origin. The annual flood of the Nile, which had sustained Egypt for millennia, they didn't see it as water. They saw it as the semen of Osiris, the god of the underworld, making the land fertile. And who is responsible for ensuring this cosmic machine continues to function? The pharaoh himself. The pharaoh was more than just a king. He was the living embodiment of Horus, tasked with maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order. He was essentially the high priest of sex. His health, virility, and, most importantly, his fertility were directly linked to the nation's survival. His erection was a leading economic indicator. A royal orgasm was believed to have magical powers to ensure a bountiful harvest. His every act in the bedroom was a national ritual. This may sound crazy, but the evidence for their open attitude towards sex is undeniable. Consider the Turin erotic papyrus. It is not a religious text. It is essentially an ancient world erotic comic book. It depicts unbelievable scenes. Men with comically exaggerated penises performing acrobatic acts with lustful women. It is humorous, earthy, and completely shameless. It shows that sex for them was not just a solemn ritual. It was also a pastime, a natural and joyful part of life. But this is where things take a dark turn. When your entire civilization is built on a biological promise, failure is not an option. What happens when the Nile doesn't flow enough? What happens when drought sets in and famine looms? To us, it's a natural disaster. To them, it's a personal failure on Pharaoh's part. It's proof that he's weak, that he's powerless, that he's let down the gods. The pressure on the Pharaoh was unimaginable. He had to prove his power. He had to restart the cosmic machine at all costs. The rituals became increasingly frenzied. They believed that the desert could be fertilized through public ceremonies. The texts describe pharaohs performing symbolic acts to flood the land with their energy. But what happens when such symbolic acts fail? When prayers and rituals fail to bring rain? Desperation calls for more extreme measures. If the body of one man, even a divine king, is not enough, then more fuel is needed for the cosmic fire. They needed other bodies, younger bodies, bodies that could be trained, molded, and ultimately sacrificed on the altar of cosmic control. This led to the creation of an institution so horrifying that its true purpose was hidden for centuries, cloaked under names like temple dancers or sacred singers. But the truth was far more horrifying. They were schools of sexual training for children. The great temples of Egypt, like Karnak or Luxor, were more than just places of worship. They were factories, centers of industry. And the product they produced was a very special kind of sacrifice. Children turned into sexual objects for the gods. You've heard the fancy terms: temple dancer, sacred singer, servant of the gods. These are lies created to cover up an unspeakable truth. These titles are code for a state-sponsored, religiously justified system of child trafficking and abuse. It operates coldly and efficiently. First, the selection process. Where did these children come from? Some were spoils of war, the offspring of defeated enemies, stripped of everything and turned into temple property. But more terrifyingly, many were the children of Egypt's elite themselves. Noble families would offer a child to the temple as a way of showing their piety and buying the favor of the gods. They were convinced that this was the greatest honor, that their child had been chosen to serve the gods most intimately. Then there was the theological justification, a disgusting distortion of logic. The priests created a doctrine that turned abuse into worship. They taught that the body of an innocent child was the most perfect bridge between the human and divine realms. A sexual act performed on such a child was not considered a sin. It was considered a prayer. The child's, or the abuser's, orgasm was said to send a powerful stream of energy directly to the gods, appeasing them and ensuring prosperity. They weaponized innocence. Then comes the training. From a very young age, these children are taken from their families and subjected to a brutal process of psychological and physical breakdown. Their immature bodies are forced into unnatural positions, trained to be flexible for complex sexual acts. Psychologically, they are taught to detach emotionally from their bodies. Their bodies are not theirs. They are a tool, an offering that belongs to the temple. Their spirits are broken before their bodies are destroyed. And of course, it was all about money and power. The system was a huge moneymaker for the priesthood. Surviving legal documents show that these children were bought and sold like cattle, their value determined by their age, appearance, and level of training. Wealthy nobles, high-ranking officials, and even pharaohs would pay the temple huge sums for the, quote, privilege of participating in these prayer. The priesthood not only controlled the path to the afterlife, they also controlled a lucrative sex industry on earth. For the children, the outcome was almost always tragic. Many died from internal injuries, disease, or simply exhaustion. Medical texts describe childhood illnesses and injuries that modern scholars recognize as a direct result of early and sustained sexual abuse. Those who survived into adulthood were often severely psychologically damaged, unable to form normal relationships, and often died young. But the most terrifying thing is that all of this happened in an orderly, systematic way, hidden behind the high stone walls of the temples. It was controlled chaos. There is a time of year, however, when that chaos is no longer contained. A time when the temple doors are thrown open, and the entire nation, from pharaoh to peasant, is commanded to abandon all social conventions and indulge in a week-long festival of drunkenness, sex, and violence. Any behavior is permitted, and any excess is considered holy. They call it the Drunken Festival, and it makes what happens in the temples look like child's play. For 51 weeks of the year, Egyptian society operates on Ma'at, a sacred concept of order, balance, and justice. Everyone knows their place. Every rule is followed. But for 1 week, just 1 week, the entire nation is commanded to throw that order aside and plunge into utter chaos. They must. It is a religious imperative. As the festival began, Egyptian civilization collapsed. The Greek historian Herodotus described the scenes he witnessed in horror. Thousands of people crammed onto barges sailing down the Nile, men and women playing music, singing and shouting. He wrote that women on the boats would boo, jeer, and lift up their skirts in front of those on shore. Social boundaries disappeared. Slave owners had sex with their slaves openly. Husbands and wives abandoned their families to join wandering orgies. Homes were broken into, and residents were dragged out to join in the chaos. Violence was encouraged as much as sex. Fighting, biting, and scratching were not considered crimes. They were seen as signs of devotion, a way for a mortal to touch the divine wrath of Sekhmet. Many died during the festival, trampled by the crowds, or as a result of violent sexual acts. But their deaths were not seen as tragedies. They were seen as the ultimate sacrifice. Why would a highly organized state allow, or even order, such a week of anarchy? Because it was a cunning political strategy. It acted as a pressure release valve. By allowing the populace to release all their pent-up anger, frustration, and desires in a controlled period of time, the pharaoh ensured that they would be docile and compliant for the rest of the year. It was intentional chaos to maintain absolute control. After 7 days, the music stopped. The intoxication wore off. The Egyptians awoke to a world of wounds, guilt, and often no memory of what they had done. They cleared the streets, buried the dead, and returned to the strict order of Ma'at. The children conceived during that chaotic week were called children of the gods, a constant reminder of the divine madness lurking just beneath the surface of their great civilization. For centuries, this cycle of order and chaos has been the beating heart of Egypt. But what happens when a new power, a rising empire, enters the Nile Valley? A power that sees no divine worship in these scenes, but only barbarism and decadence. The coming clash of cultures will not simply end the festivals. It will start a war that will erase their memory from history altogether. If the chaos of the Drunken Festival was the public face of Egyptian religious extremism, the most closely guarded secrets lay behind the gilded doors of the royal palace. For to protect their divine power, the pharaohs practiced a form of genetic control so taboo that it sowed the seeds of their own downfall: systematic incest. In the modern world, incest is one of the greatest taboos, but for the pharaohs, it was a sacred duty. Their logic stemmed directly from the gods. The most powerful divine couple in their pantheon, Osiris and Isis, were more than just husband and wife. They were brother and sister. Their son, Horus, the god that every living pharaoh was believed to embody, was the product of an incestuous relationship. So when a pharaoh marries his own sister, he is not violating a social norm. He is reenacting the most sacred creation story. It is the ultimate way to prove that he is not a mortal, he is a god. Of course, there was also a more mundane political reason. Royal blood was considered holy, imbued with the essence of the gods. Marrying outsiders, whether Egyptian nobles or foreign princesses, would dilute that sacred bloodline. By marrying his sisters, or sometimes his own daughters, the pharaoh ensured that power, wealth, and divinity remained absolutely concentrated within the family. It was the ultimate form of insider trading, but with bloodlines instead of stocks. For centuries, they believed that this practice protected and strengthened their power. They were dead wrong. The clearest evidence of the genetic disaster they inflicted on themselves lies in the golden coffin of their most famous king, Tutankhamun. For decades, we knew him only by his golden mask, but in 2010, modern science broke the royal lie. DNA tests confirmed a shocking truth. King Tut's parents were biological brother and sister. His father was almost certainly the heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten. His mother was one of Akhenaten's sisters. Tutankhamun was the product of generations of incest, and his body paid the price. The pure bloodline they had tried to protect had turned into a genetic poison. Analysis of his mummy revealed a long list of diseases and deformities. He had a cleft palate. He had a clubfoot, which left him with a limp and required more than 130 walking sticks found in his tomb. He suffered from Kohler's disease, a rare bone disease that causes bone tissue in the feet to die, causing excruciating pain. His immune system was so weak that he contracted malaria several times, and it was probably a severe bout of malaria combined with a broken leg that killed him as a teenager. The Golden King, the symbol of Egyptian splendor, was actually a sickly, crippled teenager, the product of a system obsessed with purity to the point of self-destruction. And he was not alone. Evidence suggests that his father, Akhenaten, may have also been the product of incest. Later, the Ptolemaic dynasty, including the famous Cleopatra, also practiced sibling marriage. It was a cruel irony. In a desperate attempt to maintain cosmic order and preserve their divine bloodline, the pharaohs created chaos in their own genetic code. The system designed to create living gods produced weak and fragile rulers. For centuries, Egypt has looked inward, obsessed with purifying its blood, believing it is preserving its power. It never realized that it was creating the very weakness that would make it vulnerable. And as the dynasty rotted from within, a new power was rising in the Mediterranean. A force that was pragmatic, ruthless, and had no respect for incestuous gods. The coming of the Greeks would not be just a clash of armies. It would be a clash of biology. And the weak royal blood of Egypt stood no chance. The Egyptian dynasty, weakened by generations of incest, had no idea that it was on a collision course with an entirely different force. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, he didn't just conquer a land. He opened a Pandora's box of religious and sexual secrets. Alexander's successors, the Greek pharaohs of the Ptolemaic dynasty, were pragmatic. They did not share the mystical belief that their phalluses controlled the Nile. But they were smart politicians. To rule the Egyptians, they had to become Egyptians. They called themselves pharaohs, married their own sisters to continue the tradition, and engaged in rituals that they found repugnant to their hearts. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, was a master of this double game. To the Egyptians, she was the embodiment of the goddess Isis, dressed in ceremonial dress and performing ancient rituals. But to her Roman lovers, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she was a refined, seductive, and cultured Greek queen. This duplicity of rule created a culture of hypocrisy. Extreme sexual rituals did not disappear, they simply went underground. The drunken festival may have been toned down in public so as not to offend the Romans, but in temples and private estates the orgies continued, perhaps becoming more desperate as priests tried to hold on to their waning power. This was the beginning of the first cover-up, hiding their practices from the eyes of a changing world. But that delicate balance was shattered when Egypt officially became a Roman province in 30 BC. The new ruler, Emperor Augustus, had neither curiosity nor tolerance. He was a conservative moral reformer who was trying to restore traditional Roman values. What he saw in Egypt, the public sex festivals, the worship of animal gods, the powerful priests, and the incestuous pharaohs, was not simply foreign. To him, it was evidence of barbarism, a disease that needed to be eradicated. The Roman crackdown was swift, systematic, and brutal. They didn't just stop sponsoring festivals. Roman soldiers were ordered to destroy evidence. Reliefs depicting explicit sexual acts in temples were ripped from the walls. Libraries of papyri, containing thousands of years of knowledge about Egyptian ritual, medicine, and sexual magic, were burned. The Romans launched a campaign of cultural obliteration. Priests of the old faiths who refused to abandon their gods were hunted down and executed. Their power was broken forever. And the fate of the temple children, victims of the old system, was tragic. When the Romans closed the, quote, training schools, these children were released into a world they did not understand. Deeply traumatized, with no skills beyond sexual servitude, many starved to death, became prostitutes, or joined mystery cults that sought to recreate the chaos they had known. The system that created them was destroyed, but the psychological scars it left echoed through the generations. The Romans thought they had buried the secrets of the Nile forever. They turned Egypt into their breadbasket and tried to erase the memory of a past they considered shameful. And for nearly 2,000 years, they were right. The world forgot the dark side of the pharaohs. But they couldn't level every temple. They couldn't find every tomb hidden beneath the sand. They simply created a giant historical crime scene. And they didn't anticipate the curiosity of a new kind of conqueror, one who would come to Egypt not with swords and spears, but with shovels and brushes. When the 19th century British and French gentlemen began digging in the sand, they weren't looking for the truth about sexual mores. They were looking for gold and glory, but what they found instead would horrify them so much that they decided the world should never know. They would begin the second greatest cover-up in history. The 19th century was the golden age of Egyptology. Names like Giovanni Belzoni, Flinders Petrie, and Auguste Mariette became heroes, revealing a lost world to an astonished Europe. They painted a picture of Egypt as noble, spiritual, and grand. It was an elaborate lie, because what they actually found in the stifling darkness of the tombs, on the brittle papyrus scrolls, and in the hidden carvings, was so nakedly sexual and repulsive to them that they initiated a conspiracy of silence that lasted for more than a century. They did not see a complex and distinct culture. They saw filth, depravity, and they believed it was their duty to protect the civilized world from this obscene truth. The cover-up took many forms, both blatant and subtle. First, there was outright destruction. Flinders Petrie, who has been called the father of modern archaeology, openly admitted in his diaries to destroying artifacts he deemed too obscene to display. He burned papyrus scrolls and smashed figurines depicting sexual acts he could not bear. Then there was the physical cover-up. When the explorer Giovanni Belzoni explored the tomb of Seti I in 1817 and found frescoes depicting graphic sexual scenes, he did not write them down. He ordered his workers to plaster over them, hiding them from the world. He was Kyriolektika, covering up the past. Then there was the creation of secret collections. Founders of great museums, such as Auguste Mariette of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, created secretums, secret rooms, or locked vaults, where they hid thousands of sensitive antiquities. The British Museum in London still has thousands of such items in storage, vaguely labeled miscellaneous ceramics or decorative objects, never to be shown to the public. But perhaps the most subtle form of censorship was through translation. Victorian scholars, when translating ancient texts, often took it upon themselves to censor, replacing explicit sexual descriptions with flowery, euphemistic language, or simply deleting passages entirely. The Ebers Medical Papyrus, one of the most important surviving medical texts, contains extensive sections on contraception, sexually transmitted diseases, and sexual techniques, which were ignored by translators for nearly a century. The result of this conspiracy of silence? It created a sanitized version of Egypt, a Disney version of history that persists to this day. The image of Egypt you know, with its majestic pyramids, solemn pharaohs, and silent gods, is an illusion created by men who act as moral censors, not scientists. But you can't hide the truth forever. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new technology has given us the power to see what the Victorians couldn't or didn't want to see. CT scanners can peer through the linen of sealed mummies without opening them. DNA analysis can reveal the secrets of royal bloodlines. The conspiracy of silence is about to be broken by science. And the ultimate truths, revealed by our own modern magic, may be the most shocking of all. For more than a century, the truth about Egypt was protected by two layers of silence: the sands of the desert and the shame of Victorian archaeologists. Then came the 21st century, and we brought tools that no priest or hypocrite could have imagined: DNA sequencing machines, CT scanners, and forensic chemistry. The mummies began to speak, and their stories were stranger than legend. The final truth about royal incest came not from a censored document, but from King Tutankhamun's own genetic code. His DNA proved beyond doubt what the pharaohs had tried to justify with religion. He was the product of a sibling relationship. Science confirmed that their divine bloodline was a genetic quagmire, causing the diseases and deformities that plagued the young king to death. The lie of royal purity had been shattered at the molecular level, and so we return to the original mystery. The mystery has been shrouded in secrecy from the very beginning. What really happened to King Tutankhamun's penis? Modern CT scans have allowed us to peer through his body without damaging it. And Egyptologists now have two main theories. The safe, widely accepted one is that it was an accident, a mistake during the hasty embalming process, or that it was broken during excavation by tomb robbers, or even Howard Carter's team. But there is another theory, one that is far more disturbing, but one that fits with everything we know about their extreme belief system. Some Egyptologists believe that Tutankhamun's penis was deliberately removed and mummified while erect, a magical attempt to transform him into a permanent incarnation of Osiris, the god of rebirth. They believe that after the religious turmoil of his father, Akhenaten, the priests performed a final, desperate act of sexual magic on the body of the young king, hoping that his symbolic fertility powers would heal a broken land. We may never know for sure, but the undeniable truth is that the bodies of their kings and queens were altered, mutilated, and used as pawns in a cosmic game we are only beginning to understand. The golden treasures and the Great Pyramids are not mere marvels of engineering. They were built on the foundations of these dark secrets. They were powered by a cosmic machine that consumed the bodies and innocence of man. Egyptian civilization is a cautionary tale of what happens when sex, religion, and state power become dangerously intertwined. We have broken the silence of the Victorians. We have peeled back the shrouds of the mummies. But the sands of Egypt are deep. The secrets they still hold are vast. The ultimate question we must ask ourselves is not just what the Egyptians did, but how many other truths about our own complex and brutal history are still waiting, buried in silence, for the right tools to emerge and make the dead speak again.